Hello and welcome to Failure Analysis. My name is Kevin Jordan, and we're here watching Preach's video about the man behind the loot. This is Travis Day. He'll introduce himself in a minute as part of the video. But this is Travis Day, a guy I used to work with. And let's see here what he has to say and what Preach has to say to that, and then what I have to say to that. And the train continues.
In the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King. This is...
Sorry, I'll restart.
Ladies and gentlemen, you might be wondering, who is this guy? Who's that guy? That's the guy who made badges in the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King. This is the guy. There he is. And loot has obviously been a hot topic recently with World of Warcraft. Certainly on the channel. A lot of people dissatisfied with BFA's loot system. They find it...
Alrighty, just to clarify, he may have physically typed in all the data and whatnot to create badges, but the badges idea was not necessarily his, and it probably had a lot of influence from Jeff Kaplan and Alex Afrasiabi, as well as Tom Chilton, to come up with the idea of badges on how to solve the loot issues. Potentially Pardo, though I don't know that for sure. But yeah, so I wouldn't want all of the blame or credit to go to Travis for badges.
Very confusing. It has all sorts of problems. And we talked about, you might remember the old Gear Monster, about how there are many, many elements of the whole gearing system that people had a problem with. So who better? And I want to give big shout outs to Sergey here, who contacted me this evening saying, do you know the dude responsible for World of Warcraft's reward structure for a long time actually did a full talking about randomized loot, talking about deterministic loot, where you know what you're going to get, the pros and cons, the lessons Blizzard learnt, the changes they made, including Warforged, Titanforged, that came from that. Did you know that? I did not. Now, this thing is here. This is Travis Day, working for Blizzard. This is from 2017, I believe. Yeah, 2017, at the GDC event. It's an hour long. Well, it's actually 50 minutes long. There's 10 minutes of Q&A. I've watched through this thing twice. I'm obviously not going to sit here and blast you with a 1 hour video. I will link it down below, and I strongly encourage you guys to watch this, because I'm going to have some faith in you guys here, because I'm going to point out some highlights that are relevant to our recent discussions. But context is everything. Context is crucially important. People try and take me out of context all the time, and anybody who has a public voice, it's easier to...
I'm going to stop him there just to say, I will hit you with an hour-long video, and I'll spend 2 hours dissecting it. But yeah, good on him for editing it down. Something I don't do. It probably should.
Chop out the important things to make it suit your needs. So I truly encourage you to watch this. I'm going to try and give you context for everything he said. Like I said, I've watched through this twice, so I'm going to be as honest and genuine as possible, but your interpretation of things might be different from my interpretation of things. I'm not really talking about whether or not you like what he's saying or dislike what you're saying, just how you interpret what he's saying. So sometimes he's going to be talking about World of Warcraft, because he worked on World of Warcraft seemingly here up until about Mist of Pandaria, and then moved over to the Diablo 3 team during the development of the Reaper of Souls expansion, because they were having trouble with their loot system. So you can see he's wearing the Diablo t-shirt there. Looks like Diablo to me. And so that's the history. So he does mention Legion. No mention of BFA at this point. It's 2017. There will be talk of legendary items. There is talk of Titan forging on the Warforging system and why that came about. And I think you're going to find this really interesting. So we're going to move. Let's do this a little bit. I'm going to try and give him to tell a story. So he's going to tell us a story now about drip feeding rewards. Something that has been a big concern in the community for a while now is drip feeding rewards. And I think we're going to go to about here. And he's going to tell a story of two groups of kids. So I'm going to let him tell it. I want to go to about here.
Video games. So anytime I talk about the importance of maintaining rewards, I usually tell the story of the overjustification effect, and the decades of research done on the topic. Generally, the story that I like to share is one of two small groups of children. Group one is set down at a table with crayons and told, we're going to pay you a quarter for every picture you color us. Group two is also set down at a table with crayons and paper and said, feel free to draw. So the first group of children will continue coloring for far longer than the second group, but at any point that the payment stops, if you stop giving them a quarter for the pictures, they'll stop coloring. This is similar to the effect we see in video games all the time, where players are usually carried through a game, whether through leveling or progression of some variety, and often once a player reaches a certain point, that reward mechanism disappears, whether it's you stop gaining experience or whatever carried you through the system stops moving you forward.
Okay. Pause.
Sorry, I haven't done this in presentation
Pause,
mode.
please. Spacebar. Okay, so what he's talking about here is, it's a little ropey on this, because I did read up on this subject, because I hadn't heard of it referred to as the overjustification effect. But what he's talking about clearly, as you can hear there, is a group of people will play a game or do an activity, but if you keep rewarding them, they'll play for way, way longer than the first team, right? So you've got these two separate groups of people. One is just doing it for fun, for as long as they care about it. They're going to play for way less. The guys who are being drip-fed rewards and keep getting rewarded for doing the thing, either that be experience or gear or whatever, they're going to keep playing for longer. However, they will immediately stop, pretty much, when they stop getting rewarded. So you have this kind of back and forth. What you might have is a group of people, and this is what's clearly in the literature here, is that maybe they're not actually having that much fun. They might be enjoying themselves a little bit, but not having as much fun as the guys who had the freedom to get up and leave if they wanted to. But they, you know, some people will stick around for a really long time there, but not everybody. But they do like the reward. But as soon as the reward stops, they're absolutely not going to continue in any way, shape, or form. And if you want people, obviously, from a business perspective, to keep people playing, you need to keep rewarding them. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And this is not something that I'm bashing Blizzard for. This is a very normal thing. It's an extremely normal thing that's applied absolutely everywhere. But it does make you understand why we have drip feed reward systems. So a simple analogy in BFA's terms would be the emissary system, which as your item level increases, that whole system just bumps itself up to keep spoon feeding you that little bit more, to keep giving you the carrot on a stick, so to speak. And the idea is they don't really want you to skip ahead, because they know via the data and the research here that when you stop getting rewards, the game ends, and that's it. You're kind of stuck. You don't know where to go.
Right, so let me interrupt him here. I watched this video earlier, not the one with Preach. I'm watching this one for the first time, but this GDC talk. And what was interesting to me is that that the struggle that Travis takes on at this point is how to keep a reward system essentially dripping at the correct rate in order to keep people invested long enough to get them to the next piece of content. And I feel like that's the rabbit hole that a lot of WoW has gone down, which ignores the problem or the fact that, you know, the group of kids that just has crayons and paper, they just want to draw because it's fun, right? They don't need a reward system in order to draw new things, right? And so when I look at this, I think of the problem of, well, how do we keep the kids supplied with crayons and paper, right? And cool activities to draw, or cool things to draw. How do we spark their imagination and keep them connected to the activity, right? Rather than focusing on the reward system and the problems that the drip feeding thing has, which is once you stop, once they run out, that's it, they're done. And so I feel like they took the wrong big picture approach. And, you know, it's easy for someone like Travis who's working on loot and only loot, because that's his job, is to figure out what to do with loot, how to keep loot fresh, how to keep it dropping at the right rates. But it takes a game designer that has the vision of the game in hand to realize that loot isn't the only part of this issue. It's how do we keep make sure that there's plenty of content. How do we make sure that that content stretches across a lot of time? And the loot is a piece of that, but content isn't all loot, right? And I feel like BFA, for a while now, WoW has moved into a very strong loot component as the content. What am I chasing rather than what am I doing? How am I having fun? Things like that. So let's see what else Preach has to say about it.
So the idea is for the average user, and he does make a point in this actually. He doesn't like the term casual, which I was fully thumbs up with. Doesn't like the term casual because it's too nebulous. It doesn't mean anything. The average user. The average user isn't going to get the super high item levels. They're not going to reach that level. So they focus on making that game a very steady progression. And he will go on to discuss in later terms how people want to feel rewarded whether they play for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours and don't feel like they're wasting time. Hence why the Paragon system was brought into Diablo, because loot was so hard to get at certain points that was worth getting that people could play for a whole night, 2 nights, 3 nights, not get anything. So the Paragon system was what was justified by the overjustification effect. It's like we can still say something like they still gain Paragon levels. That is fully transparent in Legion, the artifact power system, right? So you can...
Yeah, what a stark difference I see here between the type of game Diablo is and the type of game World of Warcraft is. World of Warcraft has so many other layers, so many other components that keep people playing beyond the loot, whereas Diablo is like the ultimate expression of the treadmill for loot, right? The gameplay is actually fun for a while, but after that it becomes, more repetitive, and the loot is what keeps you going. And they talk about, from the design perspective, I've heard the Diablo guys use the term, time to upgrade, and they actually try to math out how long it takes, for their loot tables to deliver an item that, is essentially an upgrade for each person. And at the start of the game, it's like seconds, right? And then eventually it gets down to hours, and they try to evaluate what is the longest amount of time, right? So most of the game design focus about player retention was about time to upgrade, and so that's a very loot driven, loot heavy experience type of game, whereas WoW was never intended to be Diablo with more players, right? But that's what it has sort of become in a lot of ways as it's aged. And the two different types of games have very different needs and present very different experiences if the philosophies of the MMO are, reinforced constantly. And they do the kind of things that Diablo doesn't do and can't really do well.
You can see how these systems go hand in hand. Yeah, you didn't get an upgrade tonight, but the reason we have systems like this is because of this effect. And it's unfortunate that in BFA, and our dude right here, is actually going to say he doesn't like some of the things that happen in World of Warcraft, certainly in Modern Era. And you can almost see, and maybe I'm projecting here, when he mentions Time Forge, it's like, there's kind of like a, that's not that fun, but there's a reason for it. Okay, so he's going to go on to take responsibility. Again, watch it yourself, get your own interpretation. I beg of you to do that. Let's go to here. So what he's going to talk about, this slide is going to be super interesting to you. The time we broke the WoW reward structure. Curious, right? The time he broke the WoW reward structure. He's talking about badges. So this is a relatively long section. Let's go to the brief introduction.
Balanced, deterministic, and random, aka that time we broke the WoW reward structure. So I'm going to tell the story of Badges of Justice. This is a story from many, many years ago that some of you may or may not be familiar with.
Okay. So this is the Burning Crusade, as you can see, brings in the Badge of Justice. And some of you are going to go, broke it? This is what he believes was the detriment of this whole thing. So we're actually going to jump ahead a little bit here. Now, I truly want you to watch it. He's talking about they added badges to various sources because they couldn't really justify why they didn't have badges. So it's like the addition of Badges of Justice to Karazhan. And then the raid, because Karazhan loot was pretty bad. There are some things left out here, like Karazhan loot was buffed in order to be better, but simultaneously they added badges to Karazhan, because why aren't they giving badges for Karazhan? And then the raiders were saying, well, why aren't we getting badges for raiding? Like, the gear's still pretty good. Like, why are we not getting badges for that? So they started adding badges to everything. And what they ended up with was just nullifying that whole system, because everybody was getting flooded with badges. And I'm going to play, this is the longest section of this I'm going to play. This is about a minute long. And it's the emblem system of World of Warcraft and how he believes that this was a disaster. Now, this will look very familiar to those of you who played during this time, certainly in Wrath of the Lich King. And the idea they aimed for here is that they had, in TBC, they had one universal currency, which was badges. But that worked for the whole game. So people were buying all sorts of loot. And it was a problem. They consider it a car crash. He considers it a complete disaster that they had this system. In Wrath of the Lich King, the solution to that system, and this is a running theme, and I think it's the big theme of this video, is Blizzard coming up with solutions to problems, right? So they figured the badges are a problem. It doesn't matter whether you agree or not. Blizzard believed it. Or certainly Travis did. That the badges system was too complicated, it was too silly. And then they came up with a solution for that. The problem that doesn't get addressed here is that the initial source of the problem disappears, but the solution to that problem remains, right? So you've put a solution in place to a problem that no longer exists, and that means that the solution you put in place is counterintuitive to the issue itself. So I'm going to play this 1 minute.
Yeah, and I think I know where he's going with this, and I Preach is 100% correct here. It seems like I've heard Titan Forging and Warforging were, from their own mouths, an attempt to fix the problem with badges, right? And it's like a Band-Aid, though, right? Like, you're treating the symptoms instead of the disease, and they should have gone back and looked at what was causing all these problems, right? Like, but for whatever reason, they felt, well, we can't just go back to what we were doing. Not even to the point where we can reevaluate what we were doing with all the things we know now and take another look at it, solving that problem now in today's universe. They just figured, well, we have to Band-Aid the next thing, and then Band-Aid the next thing, and then Band-Aid the next thing. So what they need to do is go back and look at the original problem, and like Preach says, if it even exists, and then tackle the design problem from there.
Guys who used to work on this with us, and my thought was, what the hell were we thinking? So this is what badge system looked like during Wrath of the Lich King. There were ultimately 5 different types of badges with 5 different vendors associated with them, and if you could find a badge, you'd have to go to a city and look for, like, all right, which of these vendors is the right vendor, and you could downgrade badges in case you missed a set piece you really had to have. It was a train wreck.
Yeah, and badges are so terrible. I mean, obviously, he mentions a couple things there, but the simple thing that I hate badges for is it is so much less enjoyable to purchase an item from a vendor for badges than it is to loot a thing off of a monster that you just killed. That was a huge challenge, and your whole party's excited, they're celebrating, and then there's this second follow-up phase to that excitement of, ooh, what did we get? Like you get to open and see what's in the chest, right? That experience is the ultimate gear delivery system, and badges or buying from a vendor is, in my opinion, the worst system in terms of like player enjoyment.
The whole thing was terrible. So we ended up with way more than we wanted, and ultimately, I don't know, I'm sorry. If you played through this, I'm sorry, it's my fault. I apologize. The whole thing was just a total phrasing, can't say. So, while we were working on all that, we kept getting feedback like, hey, these systems are better, we fix a lot of problems. Granted, this is 10 years ago us, and we were naive. But I remember Tom coming to me and saying, hey, I still haven't got my set piece, it would be really cool if I could just buy that because I've been trying to get it for 2 months. Why don't we just put the sets on the vendors too? Like, okay, we could put the sets on the vendors too. Why not? We've got 5 different tiers of badges. Most players are going to be in.
So you can see the roll of the eyes there. So I believe he's talking about Tom Chilton, who hadn't got his tier set or whatever, and was like,
is
I've
indeed.
been farming this for ages, and I haven't got it. Can we put it on a vendor?
And that was essentially like the player experience, right? There were certain people that just couldn't get the items they wanted to drop. And so, and this is why Tom sometimes has trouble with game design, because he thinks like a player at the exclusion of thinking like a designer and what's right for the game, what's healthy for the game. And you know, he was Travis's superior, and so Travis was probably like, yeah, okay, I guess we could do that. When it was like Tom was basically like, yeah, let's do that, right? So that he could get his set pieces faster, but not necessarily what was healthy for the game.
And this then leads to this. I'm going to bring this image up for you here, because I think it summarizes it pretty well. Is the snowball effect. And this is where it all starts to collapse, because remember, what's about to happen is he's going to describe that everything became pretty much vendor based. So this would have been around Trial of the Crusader. That's when tier sets and stuff were just had a price tag to them, and they made loot feel like a paycheck. So you would literally be able to sit down and work out when you were going to get all your gear. Like, there was no way of getting it any faster. This is when I'm going to get it, and therefore we just played along those rails, and it took all the fun out of loot. I agree. It's one of the reasons I really hate Dragon Wrath from the Firelands. If you were part of a guild that was acquiring Dragon Wraths for your guild, everybody had a set date of winning, because it was all very deterministic on when it would arrive. It was not an exciting moment to get the legendary staff. Like,
okay, so I also have to point out here, notice the difference between a system that randomly delivers loot and its presentation and reception back when, in the old days, when it was, you know, loot a dragon and there may or may not be the piece you wanted on it, versus the Titan forging experience of now, you know, nowadays. Again, it's just a random system that delivers the loot you want. It may or may not have the piece, right? But the presentation and the reception, and those are the fine details that make such a huge difference in how, you know, the human brain receives these things, and the emotional responses, right? So Preach is talking about another random system that he actually enjoyed. You know, when he says it took the fun out of loot, the badges took the fun out of loot, I totally agree. But all that was a system where randomly you got the piece you wanted or you didn't, which is exactly what we have now in BFA, but it feels a million times worse, right? So it's important to note that random loot the fact that it's random hasn't changed, but the presentation has changed, and for the worse.
there's some excitement, sure, but it was so predetermined, it was so set in stone as to when that would happen, that a lot of the fun, certainly compared to the dropping of a Thunder Fury or the dropping of a Warglaive, just wasn't there, because you were guaranteed to get it on, like, this date. This is the week I'll get it. There'll be a couple of shards or whatever either side, but it's going to be here. And it won't be before, it won't be after. And it makes loot really boring. And this is a solution where they started to randomize loot.
Looked around and realized, okay, we've instead replaced sort of the heart of what it is to kill a boss and the excitement of link the loot with something that sort of felt like a paycheck. We've instead replaced the anticipation of seeing what items dropped and figuring out who gets them with the system of killing a boss, seeing +5 badges, and going, sweet, in 372 badges, I'll have my set, I'll be done. So let me look at my calendar. Awesome, 3 months from now, I'll have everything I want. Once we replaced that sense of anticipation, with something that felt like a foregone conclusion, the players stopped being excited about killing the content or doing the raids they'd been doing, and instead felt like we were creating this really grindy system and sort of keeping everything back from them.
Okay, so that probably resonates heavily with you with BFA in terms of the Azerite armor and the heavy grind system. And it is very strange because we're about to lose Travis. He's going to leave World of Warcraft soon and move over. But he does talk to the WoW developers quite a lot, and there's a lot of discussion about that. As you can see, we're only 16 minutes into the video.
Wait, when is this video made? This was made yesterday? All right. Yeah, so to let you know, Travis has been gone from the company for a while. He worked on Diablo 3 after Reaper of Souls up until he left the company, as far as I know. But he's gone. He's been gone for months. Like, it might be as long as a year now. And he's on another project at another company. So, just to clarify, if you're hoping yeah, this recording, so is Preach talking about when he's going to, because this was just unarchived recently. This is an old video that just unarchived recently. But I think Preach might believe that he's still at the company. I'm not sure.
The issue here is, for me, as I'm listening to this being told, is this is a guy with a ton of experience who's learning a lot as he goes on. And is doing his best. And quite honestly and openly, this is why I really like this. Honestly, openly says sometimes they were like, fuck it, let's give it a try. And, you know, let's see what happens. But what he is going to bring up here is a crucial, distinct difference between World of Warcraft and Diablo. And that is balance. That is balance. So he's actually going to take us back to vanilla, and I want you to hear his discussion on this. So he does a reasonable talk on Diablo 3. Definitely is relevant to World of Warcraft, but again, I'm trying to point out the highlights here that I think you guys will immediately be like, I'm interested in this. So he's going to take us back to vanilla to the Ultra Flash Shadow Reflector. I had this, was tremendous, could reflect fear and stuff. I had this on I think my rogue still has this in his bank. But let's hear what he has to say about what was, and I still fondly remember, as a very cool item.
And long ago in a land far away, there were actually items that were so completely untunable that we didn't know what to do with them. This is a screenshot of an old engineering trinket. Some of you may or may not remember this. This would allow you to, on use, reflect a spell back at the caster.
Okay, so the point is there, Blizzard didn't know what to do with these items, and in fact he goes on to say that they were completely untunable. There was nothing we could do about it. So what was the problem with the Shadow Reflector? Well, his example is a little weak, I would say. Is that some bosses did shadow damage, and the Shadow Reflector could reflect that shadow damage and kill the boss, which can be fixed in a number of different ways. But the decision was made way back then, which feels now to me as a player like it was a crippling decision. Was that we have to just remove these items from the game, things like this, because they're just too hard to balance. For me, it's more a case of make them more niche in where they go. Like, do I think that there should be items, for example, that can reflect, you know, a boss ability that kills the boss? No. And in fact, we saw that with Lady Sinestra, and Paragon realized they could put back, due to a DK's Dark Simulacrum, they could reflect one of the major boss abilities, and Sinestra would essentially suicide, and they were like instantaneously killed themselves because like, this isn't right. I agree, that's not what it's about. What this is for is obviously for simple things like out in PvP, having fun reflecting a fear or a shadow bolt, something along those lines, or a shadow word pain even. That's why we used it as rogues, is we could reflect the shadow word pain, meaning we could get back into stealth. Very good, skillful ability. Not even overpowered. A priest taking its own shadow word pain ain't that bad. And plus, they're fun. So the reason I wanted to highlight this is this next section here, which is going, because of this decision, it's like one thing leads to another, right? And this is the theme of what I'm talking about, is one problem, perceived problem, in my opinion, it's a perceived problem, requires a solution. That solution then has problems, which then require another solution. And ultimately, we're so far away from what actually started this chain of events that it doesn't make sense anymore. But this is definitely relevant. Where are we? 28, 26 is this next one. And this slide will immediately resonate with you, which is items became math problems.
So when we got rid of scaling items, unfortunately, we ended up in a land where our items were just really complicated math problems. This also sort of was the start of where third-party websites like Ask Mr. Robot or Roar sort of came into existence, where we'd taken all the things that were interesting out of the game to make it more balanceable for us as designers. And the consequence was a player couldn't even look at any two items and figure out, well, which of these is better. We'd replaced things like 2% crit chance with 150 crit rating. Like, what does that even mean? I don't understand a rating. And the end result was no one understood anything, including the developers. Like, if you ask me, like, which of these is better, like, I don't know, probably the one that's higher level, but actually not, because I made it and I split it 3 ways instead of 2 ways. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme across a lot of elements of design. Is, that's why not even did crit go to crit rating, but it's also why the items don't have. I mean, they have the attribute you need, no matter what. They always have the correct attribute for you. It makes the designer's job easier, but that shouldn't be the goal. The goal should never be to make your job easier. It should be to make the best experience, the most fun experience. And Preach is obviously about to say something here. We'll see what he has to say on this comment. But yeah, Travis recognizes this as a mistake, and it is. At the end of the day, the job is hard, but when you do it well, the rewards are massive.
Bastard, right? They took away all the fun stuff. What they were left with was a game easier to balance, which still had problems, as you guys well know, and you might meme at that. But what it also meant is that it just became a simple maths problem.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say about this is better balance is something that players always ask for, but they rarely actually want. There are obviously outliers, but figuring out what the best stuff is actually a big part of that neckbeard experience. Noodling through all of the math or all of the decisions that make one item better for than another with a certain build and certain talent choices and all that stuff is a big part of the fun in interacting with loot. And so people that say, and this was a lesson from StarCraft that those guys learned, was that you want to create or perfect how to introduce imbalances. You need to design in imbalances where possible so that there is that difference between items that the players can figure out and feel like they're winning at the game, that they're outsmarting the designers. And they're doing things that are broken or unintended. How often do I get asked the question, was it intended that this thing worked, that I found that you could do this thing? Was it intended that, And they want to hear no. They want to hear that, oh, no, we didn't think of that. Sometimes we did and sometimes we didn't. But they want to feel like they, figured something out. And that's a big part of the loot fun. The fun with loot.
Now, the issue here is, and he freely admits this because he's asked it in the Q&A, is he truly doesn't believe Blizzard has ever solved this problem. Certainly in World of Warcraft. They've never been able to solve this problem. And someone does ask, is like, someone asked in the Q&A, would you think it was a better idea to have a single value, like item level, which should determine the quality of the item? And he says no, because it should be about fun and things that are interesting. And gameplay changes. Now, you're going to go, gameplay changes? Like Azerite, LOL, and I agree with you, because this is the problem, that they've been unable to apply this to World of Warcraft. He did get to apply this in Diablo, leading to a lot of Reaper of Souls success. Now, some of you might meme at that, but Reaper of Souls was a big rejuvenation of Diablo 3. And a lot of people put that down to this stuff, so I'm going to skip that to it here. But it's interesting to me, for sure, that they were so aware of this problem way back then, and have been utterly unable to find a solution that the game breaks, in their opinion. I don't think it does. I've got to be honest. I don't agree with this. I don't think it does break as much as they make out. Maybe there was other issues I wasn't aware of in vanilla because I was still a bit of a noob. But for me, it just doesn't really feel like it was worth the loss of fun items. No, the game can't be Diablo. Not every stat can be truly amazing and wonderful and interesting. That's not possible. But that doesn't mean we have to lose all the RPG elements. It doesn't mean that we can't have some fun stuff.
That's also a classic designer trap that I fell into as well. Believing that idea that every attribute is perfectly balanced with every other attribute for different reasons is an impossible goal, and not particularly a noble goal either. And it's usually a trap, because when you find yourself striving for that, you find yourself talking to people about that. That's the intent, that's the goal, and so people believe that you're pulling it off. And people that aren't really good at figuring out what's good for them end up doing things like Agi Spirit on their warriors, right? Thinking, well, no, Blizzard made this a thing, I'm going to do this thing, it's going to be amazing, and then they have to be shamed about it later and to realize that that was a bad idea, right? So it's a funny thing, and it's almost never actually true. Even on two attributes, even with two attributes that you intend for a particular class or build to really want, one is usually more powerful than the other. It usually is a math problem. And if you can figure out all the factors that contribute to that math problem, you can work out what's better for each situation. And so the goal really is to figure out enough different situations and challenges that the player has that there might be good uses for this attribute here and good uses for this attribute over here. And that's what makes the decision making a little more diverse, rather than just equip everything. It's all good for you, and that shouldn't really be the goal, because item level is garbage in my opinion, because people stop caring about the attributes. They just, it's higher eye level, I wear it, that's the one stat that matters, or one attribute that matters. So, and that's a really bad end game for this loot progression that we've seen from vanilla to BFA.
And legendaries in Titanforge will come up here. So this is his thoughts. I wanted to share this because Travis agrees with me, I believe.
I don't even know what that means. It's really easy to make things powerful because, well, numbers say so. But it's a lot more interesting when we could accomplish that same level of power increase in a way that would modify the player's gameplay in some way. An example I use a lot is...
there it is. That's his true belief. His true belief is that it's not fun just because it does bazillion-ty damage. It's easy to do. It's boring. This has 1,000 crit on it. Hey. Right? It's not interesting. Some players will always find it interesting to do bazillion-ty damage. They'll think that's hilarious and super fun. And none of us really want that, because we don't really want class imbalance, because, of course, it's a big problem in BFA right now. It's class imbalances all over the place. So it's a difficult one, and I understand where Blizzard is coming from here, but there's got to be some leeway somewhere to find, but they haven't been able to find it for years, so maybe not, which is a little bit sad. But we can't ignore the fact that this stuff used to exist, and did exist in a reasonably good way for a while. Class imbalance wasn't that bad. I mean, it wasn't great, but is it any better right now? I mean, Legion did the best job ever. There's a couple of things I want to give you here, which would be the last thing on Titan Forging. Now, there is a lot more to this that I think you guys should watch. It's about here. Okay.
So back on the Legion development at this point. So World of Warcraft was also sort of trying to tackle some of these problems. They wanted to recapture a sense that anything can happen, or that you could find awesome items in unexpected places. That sort of was what led to them introducing Titan Forged and allowing items to roll increasingly higher level based on the content you're doing. They also started tackling their own version of the D3 legendary system. Oops, I'm sorry.
Okay, so I wanted to highlight this moment where Blizzard, obviously, at least in terms of deciding on the reward structure, were feeling, from what I could tell here, really stuck with the fact that their loot was fucking boring, and they knew it. It's like, it's just not interesting. Our belts have slightly more haste, slightly more crit, and that's just really fucking boring. But we've also kind of hamstrung ourselves by saying we're not going to have really cool, interesting items because it breaks the game, in their opinion, right? So you've got this problem from 10 years ago rearing its ugly head, and then comes into Legion where they introduce the legendary items, and you'll be glad to know I'm not going to play any more for you now. I do want you to watch it because he does talk about Legion legendaries, which I think you'll find interesting. But what you will find is that he's not working at WoW at this time. They are communicating, and his feedback was that legendary acquisition was terrible. Right? Sounds crazy to us, and people quitting the game because of how the legendary systems were dealt with, and he felt at the time that the way Blizzard was handling it was wrong. Or more specifically, the World of Warcraft team was handling legendaries wrong, although he liked what they were doing. Like, the legendary items, having modifications to gameplay is a good way to go. Now, this is mostly my interpretation of it. I've only shown you like 30 minutes of this, 34 minutes. There's another 15 minutes of this, plus I've skipped big sections. So every single minute this guy is talking, he's talking about something interesting. Certainly in terms of deterministic and random. But for me, the overall impression I got is, one, I really like Travis. I think he's awesome. He seems to be on most of the same wavelength. I disagree with some of the things he said. Certainly in terms of the badge system and being too complicated, it felt like it was a mess. I don't think it was. As a player at the time, I didn't think this was a problem. I genuinely didn't think this was a problem. Like, certainly not a train wreck of a system. It was actually relatively clear. It was like new tiers of content come with new badges. You can even downgrade those badges in order to do something else. And then Mythic Plus came in to match out that system. Like, I don't think it was that bad. And some of you will look to Valor points and things like that. But
wasn't it the same issue that he didn't like the Justice badges for? Is that it was deterministic and how long it would take to get your loot, which was boring?
They do ultimately go into his final section of the talk, which is be generous. There it is, be generous. Now, this is more in reference to Diablo 3, which is why I didn't want to show it in this video, because it'll be slightly out of context. But a lesson he learned was just throw a lot of loot at people while having one or two really rare items in there. So they talk about ancient armor in Diablo. Because people liked getting loot. But what...
Yeah, that's totally the Diablo method, you know, the loot shower every time you kill something. Yeah, I've definitely fallen away from this concept. I think it's just a lot of spam, and you have to spend way too long just figuring out what to pick up, as opposed to like the Dark Souls approach, which is every time you see a chest, there's an item in there potentially that gives you a new game experience. That doesn't serve the Diablo method, the Diablo format, but it's proven to me that quantity over quality is not the right way to go, right? Not the right place to end up. So be generous. I originally took that as take some risks, essentially, like occasionally give players abilities or items that do things that are off the balance curve, right? But that, unfortunately, that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about quantity, which, yeah, I don't know. I don't think I agree with that at all anymore.
One thing he specifically mentions, and again, it's about Diablo, so I didn't want to really put it in and say this is like WoW content, because it's not. But what they did find is this. When they quadrupled the amount of loot that was dropping in Reaper of Souls. They quadrupled it, so people were just getting shitloads of loot, which only really affected the high-end players in terms of them getting too much loot. The average user, which is what it says, like the casual player, was getting a good amount of items that they were okay with. Hardcore players were getting more than they were okay with, but there's so few of them in comparative to most of the playbase that it wasn't a big deal. But the feedback was this, and he specifically goes out to say, you can't fix this problem. There's always a problem. Always. And they stopped getting feedback about can't find cool items because loot was dropping 4 times more than normal. People were loving it. Shinies all over the screen. Really cool. Then they started getting feedback saying trying to find a better version of my cool item. Like, I can't find the really good piece, which is...
It's funny because to me, from a game design perspective, that's the same complaint, right? Can't find cool items is can't find the item that I want that's an upgrade for over what I have currently, right? So you're still talking about time to upgrade. It's just one is spamming you with a bunch of garbage and the other isn't. So the feedback changed, but it didn't actually address the problem at all. And this isn't necessarily a problem I think has to be fixed, right? Of course people are going to say, I can't get the things I want as fast as I want to get them, right? That's just human nature, right? We want everything faster. But, you know, that carrot, right, is part of the experience. So, yeah, trying to address that specific feedback is like, yeah, I don't know.
Very relevant to BFA. Very, very relevant to BFA. So I wanted to draw awareness to this. I think it's really cool to look at the ideas Blizzard had in the background while a lot of this loot was, while our reward system was changing over the years and why they did it. A lot of it is very slapdash, actually. Very, like, haphazardly done. Like, what is a quick solution? Like, a quick and easy solution to our problem. And also some of it is very haphazard. In terms of, like, in Diablo 3, it talks about they just doubled the loot system. And then when they were like, oh, we can't turn this off because people are loving it. So they doubled it again. Like, fuck it. Like, let's just see what happens. These sort of, like, swings of hammers that we talk about with Blizzard quite a lot. So I've linked this down below. I encourage you to watch it. I'm going to return to this later on. So please leave your feedback. I would love to see your thoughts on it. Again, this is just so interesting in terms of where we are in BFA. But I will point out that, once again, this conference took place before Battle for Azeroth. And you would heavily find, if you watch this, as just as I did, a lot of conflicting ideas from the old school, which would be Travis, like the old school World of Warcraft loot and reward designers, and how arse backwards it kind of seems to be BFA in some respects. So I'll be interested to see what you guys think. Thank you so much for watching. Love you all. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.
I'll give it a like. That was good. Yeah, I think, you know, I like Preach. I like, you know, he's very focused on the part of the game that he loves. But he also really values the experience rather than the reward at the end quite a bit, which is usually can be pretty rare. For high-end, you know, for high-end gamers. So he's a good mix of qualities that I would make a game for, you know, like that's the person I wanted to make a better game for. So anyway, good video. And yeah, the GDC thing is very good if you're interested in that kind of stuff. So take a look, and thank you very much for watching my reactions. I'll put it up on YouTube soon. And if you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe, and come follow me on Twitch. I'll see you next time.